Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Grassi. I am a student at Bloomsburg University. My major currently undecided, and today I'm going to be doing a presentation for my international relations class on the true effects of the United States' drug or war on drugs. So the reason why I chose to do this topic was because, as a kid, I kind of had a certain view on drugs and drug users and stuff like that. But I guess as I've grown up and I've become a more of a member in society, I guess you could say, my view has kind of changed, and I don't know, starting to see issues on how we, as in like the U.S. and the U.S. government, deal with drugs and drug users and things like that. So this is the true effects of the United States war on drugs. And before we start, I just wanted to put the Wikipedia definition of what the war on drugs is, so people could have, kind of a better understanding. So the war on drugs is a global anti-narcotics campaign led by the United States federal government, including drug prohibition and foreign assistance, with the aim of reducing the illegal drug trade in the U.S. So with that out the way, let's go. So how the war on drugs fuels international crime, violence, and human rights issues. And real quick, just before I get in, I just wanted to kind of point out three important facts. So the first one is that the estimated illegal drug trade market value in 2024 was over $600 billion. All right. Um, if you are not aware, that is insanely huge, right? Over $600 million is an enormous amount of money. And so what that means is there also is a huge demand for these drugs, all right? So whether you like it or not, there is a ginormous demand for these drugs. And when you have a market this big, a market this big cannot disappear, right? So for all those people who are like, oh, just stop using drugs and the problem will fix itself, that is absolutely not realistic. Maybe in, fairy tale land, that's the way it works, but this is the real world. It does not work like that. Over $600 billion is insane. And a market this big cannot just simply disappear or go away, legal or not. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, who controls this $600 million market? Well, obviously that would be international criminal organizations. So because the war on drugs prohibits the production, use, and sale of these drugs, what it does is it creates this giant black market, which is essentially just an illegal market, right? And when you have these black markets, these ginormous black markets, things like internal affairs cannot be settled like legally through courts and stuff, obviously, because it's completely illegal. So the only real way to settle disputes is through violence, and this means that only the most feared and the most violent people can stay on the top. And so by prohibiting these drugs and creating this lucrative, ginormous black market, the war on drugs really kind of indirectly keeps only the most violent, like the most of the most violent and the most feared at the top, because that's the only way they can stay at the top when you are dealing with an illegal market such as this one. And then obviously, probably the most popular kind of group would be drug cartels. So the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels are two of the most powerful drug cartels in the world. Obviously, those are just two that are in Mexico. There are literally hundreds of cartels, but those are two of the most popular ones. And the reason they're two of the most popular is because they have the funds and the power to assure that no one else can take their spot of in the drug trade uh, market, the illegal drug trade market. So now we're going to talk about the black market and human rights issues, which is a very, very big issue when, focusing on this subject. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is turf control, right? So, and we pretty much just talked about this, but these criminal organizations, they use violence and fear to establish their power, right? And to settle disputes. And obviously, what this leads to is literally the death of thousands of civilians every single year. Thousands of civilians die, all in the name of installing fear and, you know, showing your power. And so I put these countries because these are some of the countries that have the most, or they deal with the most extreme drug violence. So Mexico, Colombia, Honduras, Afghanistan, Brazil, Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos. These are just a few of many countries that experience drug violence, and thousands of civilians are killed every single year um, because of this. Next would be funding global crime, and a lot of people don't know this, but you know, drug profits from drug trafficking, organizations, they don't just go to help fund the drug trafficking organization. These profits in the $600 billion market, they help fund many other global crime networks, right? And so three of the biggest ones are terrorism, arms trafficking, and human trafficking. Coincidentally, these are, three of the most popular and most contributing factors to human rights violations. If you ask somebody, oh, what kind of, crime and organization, you know, really, um, it does the most in terms of, violating human rights issues. Human trafficking and terrorism are probably two of the first ones that would come to people's mind. Arms trafficking too, and sex trafficking. But these are fueled, a lot of money that goes into them is from these drug trafficking organizations too. So the drug profits, they don't just help to fuel the drug business even more. These go to a wide array of criminal networks. So next is unjust prosecution. All right. So the U.S. and if you remember the definition of the war on drugs, I kind of talked about this a little, but the U.S. will frequently help militarize and arm local police forces and local armed forces. So, all in the name of trying to help stop the drug trade business. So, for instance, Mexico or Brazil, the U.S. will provide their local police forces with weaponry. They will provide them with training. They will provide them with all these things to help stop the drug trade and to help take down these drug traffickers. The problem is that innocent people are jailed or killed all the time, literally all the time. Um, and that's just an unfortunate reality of what happens. But when you arm these police and the armed forces, there's always going to be innocent people who have nothing to do with the drug trade business. They're going to be killed. And then the market always shifts. And so what this simply means is, when the police conduct a, a raid on one house that's been, making millions in drug trafficking and there are a bunch of drug dealers and all this stuff. While the police are working hard to take down them, three more houses have now popped up. And when you have a $600 billion market, it is always going to shift. So you try to take one person down, another comes up, and it just is a never-ending game. I'm not saying that, it's a waste to try and, enforce the law, but what I'm saying is you have to understand that, there's always going to be somebody else, somebody new who is going to come in and take the spot of whoever was just knocked off. You knock someone off, three more people are coming in. And especially when you have a $600 billion market, it's yeah, the market always shifts. And then finally, shame over solutions. So this one, a lot of people don't think about sometimes, but because of the war on drugs, heavily demonizes drugs. I put heavily in bold because it really, really, really does a good job at demonizing drugs. But people with drug addiction problems, they're often denied the help that they need. And instead of addiction being looked at as a disease or health issue, it's looked at as weak and dirty and self-inflicted, and it really, really, really is super dangerous to think like this because there are real people who have real problems and need real help, and people often ignore them and they look at them as dirty, and oh, it's a self-inflicted issue, and that's dangerous. And then, so I wanted to also do a little portion on the effects in the United States. So according to the World Population Review, it's estimated that 6% of Americans use illegal drugs. That is 20 million people, all right? That is a lot of people in the US. These are citizens. This is an enormous amount of people. And the first big effects is going to be mass incarceration. So the U.S. literally imprisons thousands of its own citizens every single year because of drugs, and the majority of these offenses are low-level, non-violent possession offenses. And I put people minding their own business in parentheses because it's pretty much what they're doing. Most of these arrests are people who have a little bit of weed or a little bit of cocaine or a little bit of MDMA, whatever drug that they're using. But they're not hurting anyone. They're not, trying to, contaminate other people. They're simply it's for personal use. They're literally minding their own business. I'm not saying what they're doing is right, but I'm also not saying what they're doing is wrong. But what I can say is that most of these people are simply minding their own business. They're not hurting anybody else but themselves, if you want to look at it like that. Um, and we're imprisoning them for it. And then the other thing is disproportionate arrests of different races. And I put cocaine versus crack cocaine sentencing in parentheses because that's probably the most prominent example of how a lot of drug like drug rules, they are built off of racist kind of foundations. So if you don't know about the cocaine versus crack cocaine sentencing disparity, in the 1980s, powder cocaine was seen as kind of an upper class drug. It was kind of like a fancy drug. It was associated with upper class citizens, predominantly white people. And then crack cocaine was associated with lower income neighborhoods, predominantly African American dominant neighborhoods. And so what happened was there was a sentencing disparity. So if you got caught with crack cocaine, you were going to jail for a lot longer than if you got caught with powder cocaine. And the issue with this is they're literally the same exact thing. From a pharmacological standpoint, cocaine and crack cocaine are literally the same drug. There's literally no difference. The only difference is that crack cocaine, it's route of administration. So crack cocaine is a crystallized version of it, so you can smoke it. And if you know anything about route of administration, if you smoke something, it hits you a lot harder and a lot quicker. It gets into your bloodstream faster. than if you were to snort something, which is what people do with powder cocaine. But they are literally the same drug, the same exact thing. But there was a big difference on sentencing, and that was predominantly due to who these drugs were kind of for, who they were associated with. So the next one is ignorance. And so the war on drugs promotes elite levels of ignorance when it comes to drugs. And this is especially true in two areas. So the first one is the ignorance to true causes of addiction. So like I said before, a lot of times addiction is seen as self-inflicted or their choice. And I'm not saying that that's not the case in some instances. However, what it does is it ignores the possibility that there might be other underlying reasons why someone might get addicted to a drug. So seen as, or it ignores mental health, poverty, and unemployment. These are three giant factors that a lot of people don't even consider, because they look at someone who's suffering from addiction and, oh, it's self-inflicted, it's their choice, they're dirty. But there could be actual reasons why someone is more likely to, or why someone is addicted to a drug. And the second area would be ignorance to drug safety. So the best example I have for that would be the education system. So I grew up in the US, I went to school in the US. I remember in middle school, that was when we had our drug education segment. I think it lasted maybe 2 classes. And pretty much all I learned was the difference between depressant, stimulant, and hallucinogen. And then they said, don't do it. Just don't do it. If you know anything about human psychology, telling people to not do something, especially kids, doesn't always work out in your favor. But besides that, all I'm saying is, instead of just saying don't do it, we should focus on harm reduction. When you look at opioid deaths in America, or opioid overdoses, aside from fentanyl overdoses, the majority of opioid overdoses aren't actually just from someone straight up taking too many opioids. A lot of times they're combining two drugs that are super deadly combined together. So a lot of times people will take opioids and then they'll drink alcohol, or they'll take benzodiazepines like Xanax, and that greatly increases your risk of respiratory depression. So when they die, in the books it goes, oh yeah, they overdosed on opioids. But what really happened was they combined too much of two drugs that are very deadly when combined together. And that's how they died. It wasn't just simply an overdose on opioids. But we don't teach this. We don't, many people are ignorant, elite levels of ignorance. They're ignorant to that fact. And remember, you can still teach harm reduction and also say, don't do it. It's not like you have to completely stop saying don't do it, but by only teaching don't do it, it doesn't work, and it's been proven that it doesn't work, and it's been proven that it leads to elite levels of ignorance when it comes to drugs. And then finally, contamination, and this is basically the fentanyl crisis. So when you make the illegal drugs illegal and you prohibit the use and the production and the sale of them, and then you give this market over to this $600 billion market, by the way, over to international criminal organizations, which we talked about earlier, you have no control, you as in the US government, you have no control over what people are getting. Right? It's the criminal organizations, the drug traffickers, the drug cartels, they have control because they run the market, because it's an illegal market, And so when you look at something like the fentanyl crisis, I mean, we have absolutely no control over what has fentanyl or what doesn't. The only way that the government can control it is by intercepting people who are actively trafficking drugs. But remember, at the top, 20 million Americans use drugs. I'm sure a lot of people that are going to watch this know someone who uses drugs. Like it's the reality is it's not very hard to, know someone or come by drugs in your life, because again, so many people use them. It's a $600 billion market. And so when you give that you basically give that market up to criminals, they decide what people get, and the only thing you can do is try to intercept it, but obviously you can't intercept everything. So the fentanyl crisis, um, you know, eh, the fentanyl crisis is pretty much an indirect result of the market being given to international criminals, of the market being illegal and it being a black market. And then finally, I just wanted to add this little slide. Obviously, I think that the war on drugs is a pretty big failure and has been. But how do we know the war on drugs is a failure? Well, simply, I would just say ask yourself these two questions. Are there still drugs in America? And have drug deaths declined or inclined in the past year? And I can tell you it's not declined. So I put the definition of the war on drugs back up there so you can remember it. And that last part is really important. With the aim of reducing the illegal drug trade in the U.S., has it been reduced? No, it has not. And not just the U.S., really all over the world. But the war on drugs has not done what it was intended to do. And it's been years and years and years. Um, so I encourage everyone to, do their own research, come up with their own opinions based on the research. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching this video. And I will see you later.